That's really my favorite thing and how I like to do these presentations. Um, I much prefer a conversation where we can talk and you can ask me about your interests rather than just talk at you for an hour. I will give you a little bit of history for those of you who may be unaware. And something I do when I talk to colleges and students, you don't have to participate in this, but I ask everybody who before today or before you heard about this presentation, this event, how many of you actually heard of the Lenape Native Americans? Oh, and I see some people raising their hands, and that's wonderful. I see a lot of people of the people I can see. I see everyone raising their hand, and that's fantastic. How many of you were aware that the Lenape Native Americans were the indigenous people of this land, of this area? Wow, you are way ahead of the game, all of you folks. Very, very culturally ahead of the game. Um, and there's a reason, if any of you that don't have your video on, I couldn't see you raise your hand or not. If you didn't raise your hand, don't feel bad. That's not on you. That's on history, and there are reasons why Lenape, the history and culture, even in this area, in their indigenous homelands, tends to be very obscure. And that's what I'm going to talk about just briefly. I want to let you know who I am and who I represent, my specific nation, which is the Lenape Nation of Pennsylvania, just one of several Lenape nations that are in the United States. So I'm, of course, not going to bore you with the history lesson about the history, tumultuous and terrible history between colonists and Native Americans. I'm sure you're all aware of that to one extent or another. But to zoom in on the particular things that affected the Lenape, the particular Lenape history. The Lenape are the indigenous people of eastern Pennsylvania, southern New York, all of New Jersey, and northern Delaware. So this tri-state area down into Delaware is Lenape, the Lenape's ancestral homeland. And the Lenape were, of course, affected by colonialism the way many, if not all, other Native American tribes were. But there were some particular not complications, but some particular circumstances with the Lenape. So what happened is when the Lenape were forcibly removed from our homelands here through either outright war and violence or underhanded land deals and all the other things that led to the forcible relocation, a large percentage of the Lenape were forcibly removed, and they moved west and northward. And this is a long, tumultuous journey that I'm just going to sum up in a few seconds. They would move a state or two away. Of course, this was before state lines were drawn, but just about that amount of distance until they could find a safe place to settle. And then they'd be able to bunker down and start building a community until colonialism caught up with them and they were forced to move again. Then they'd uproot and move again, and this went on for years and years and decades. Eventually, the large groups of Lenape that were pushed and relocated and uprooted in this way found permanent settlements out in the area of Oklahoma and Wisconsin in the United States. Two groups found homes just over the northern border of the United States and Canada, in southern Canada. But in the United States, where the large groups of Lenape, these diasporic groups, ended up settling, were in Oklahoma and Wisconsin. So that's in most of the history books. When you look in the books, you can usually find out that the Lenape used to be the indigenous people of this area, and then got relocated and had this diasporic movement where they settled out Oklahoma, Wisconsin way. What the history books often don't mention, and this isn't like ancient history, this can still be found in high school textbooks and things like that today. These books don't mention that many Lenape were able to stay here in their indigenous homeland. And the way that happened was through colonial men marrying Lenape women. That was, and that gendered language is absolutely intentional. Lenape men were not permitted to stay behind in their homeland. Men were seen as a possible threat in the future, warriors, people who might fight, so they were all driven out. However, the Lenape, well, I shouldn't say all driven out. There are definitely people who remained here by going into hiding. They're few and far between because the area was, of course, colonized and there weren't many places to remain undiscovered. But there are a few records of that. But the vast majority of the Lenape who were able to stay here in their homeland did so because colonial men took a liking to marrying Lenape women. There were several reasons for that. One of the first and foremost being that the Lenape women were incredibly hard workers. They knew inside and out the agriculture of this land. They knew how to take care of the settlement and raise the crops. And I'm not talking working in the kitchen. I'm talking like out in the fields doing the farm work, while men were traditionally out hunting and doing trade deals with other clans and things like that. So the Lenape women were really essential to the colonists surviving those first few winters in this land that was still foreign to them, working crops and agriculture with which the colonists were not familiar. So many Lenape did remain that way, Lenape women. Of course, the caveat to that was that every instance of their culture was erased, was hidden. We have rare accounts that are few and far between of rather progressive households in which the patriarch of the household, as was the structure of the time, would permit Lenape language to be spoken in the house, maybe even with the kids. But in the very rare circumstances we have of records of that did not extend outside the front door. That was not accepted in society whatsoever. In most households, and for everyone, once you walked out that front door, if you used to be Lenape, now you were a colonist. You dressed in colonial dress. The Lenape language could not be spoken in the community. Of course, our tribal ceremonies couldn't be held. Our stories couldn't be told. All of that culture was passed down only in secret, only down family lines. And the vast majority of that was all through the oral tradition, all through stories. Even writing those kinds of things down, having written records of Lenape ceremonies and language was enough to cause some real trouble and get you persecuted in a colonial society. So this is our history, the specific history of the Lenape nations who are still out here on the East Coast in our indigenous homelands. We represent the lineage of those Lenape women who were able to remain here and avoided that diasporic relocation through marriages with the colonists. And that's the nation I represent, the Lenape Nation of Pennsylvania. There are others who represent this aspect of Lenape history. There's the Nanticoke Lenape right over in New Jersey. There are two nations in Delaware. And we represent, again, the Lenape who were able to stay here. So One reason that our history tends to be very obscure here, even though this is our indigenous homeland, is that ours is a history of hiding, of doing everything we could not to be detected as Native Americans, to pass as white and colonists, even down to identifying as white on census data. So the first reason our history is obscure is because we made it that way. We had to do everything we could to hide. The second reason, another big reason, why people don't know about us, or if they've even heard about the Lenape, they think of us as a Western clan or an Oklahoma clan, and they don't know that this is where we come from, is due to the federal recognition process that the government has come up with for, recognizing us as Native American. One of the primary guidelines to gain federal recognition in the United States is that your nation needs to have had a continuous relationship with the United States government since the times of colonialism. So basically, you had to have been on the government radar from when they first got here for them today to say, okay, you're a federally recognized nation. Now, I don't even like to use the term silver lining, because those of us that were forcibly removed, those of us who went through that movement, it was such a tumultuous journey that I really don't like to say there was any good part of it. But for lack of a better term, one of the small silver linings of being pushed by the government and then having them catch up to you and being pushed again is that the American government knew where they were. They always had tabs on them because they were pushing them western and northward. So in that way, our diasporic groups that tended to split into these large groups and settle in Oklahoma and Wisconsin, they remained on the government radar all throughout colonialism. So they're the ones who, in contemporary times, when this federal recognition program was developed, they're the ones who met that criteria, that the government knew they were there and gained federal recognition. So when a lot of people, look up the Lenape or study the Lenape, it'll very often go to the government recognized sites, and those sections of our relations are much more in the public eye because of that status of being recognized. So when a lot of people search for information on the Lenape, they get our relations in Oklahoma, they get our relations in Wisconsin. We, all of us, my nation, the Lenape Nation of Pennsylvania, Nanticoke, New Jersey, the Delaware nations, we will never be eligible for federal recognition unless at some point these guidelines change. Again, because we did everything we could not to remain on the government's radar, to hide ourselves. So that's just a long explanation for any of you who weren't familiar with either with the Lenape at all, or who heard of us but thought we were a tribe out west somewhere. That's a large part of the reason why, because our history here in our homelands has been obscured intentionally in order to survive here. And it's really only historically recently that we've been comfortable coming out and reconnecting with our culture in any kind of public or group way, and really promulgating the fact that, a lot of us were able to stay here and we're still here. So, yes, I'm here from the Lenape Nation of Pennsylvania. That's my lineage here. We're all aware of each other. We work with each other from different extents. But all of the Lenape nations do have different councils. They have different organizations. So we're not the same. We're the same people relation-wise, but we're not the same community. We have our own tribal governments and things like that. So That's who I am and who I represent within the nation. I am the I'm on tribal council. We still hold our um, traditional tribal ways of self-governance. Now, it's one of these interesting things where we're also a 501c3 nonprofit group. So, in order to maintain that status, we have to have an interesting hybrid government kind of thing. We have to do the Roberts Rules of Order, if you're familiar with that, and we have a secretary and a president and all of the things to meet those guidelines. And they take care of our money and they do a wonderful job with the things that are required of them to do in those official positions. But all of our tribal governments, all of the matters that pertain to our members, to our people, to our nation, we still make our decisions in a I hate to say government, but in a governing body, in a group of council, chiefs, and clan mothers. So I'm on tribal council. I'm one of those people who advises on the direction the nation will take. And I'm also our storykeeper. And the role of the storykeeper is fluid. It's not a position that's always filled. It's a position that's filled as needed, and it just happened to work out very well for me. I'm a PhD student candidate at Temple University. I'm going for my doctoral in cultural and mythological studies. And my entire life, passion, and academic interests, and much of my work has involved cultural stories, cultural legends, religious and mythological literature. So I really just melded right into this position with my culture once I got on council. They approached me right away, and I was honored to be able to blend my academic interests with my heritage and make this just what I do with my life. So I do within my dissertation work, I have a particular focus in Lenape mythology and legends. Um, but on the broader spectrum, I look at cultural stories from all over the world. So that's a little bit about me. Now, there's tons of stuff that I can talk about, but I'd really like to hear what your interests are and really tailor the stuff I discussed to you. So, does anyone have any questions about anything I said, about the history, about what I do, or anything in particular that you'd like to talk about? Oh, I should bring up the chat and the hands here too, just in case.
Gilana, did you have something? Do you want to unmute yourself?
Sure. Yeah. Thank you so much for presenting. So my name is Gilana. I'm the teacher for the 6th and 7th grade class at the religious school here. I'm really interested to hear more about a few sort of broader themes that you talked about, which are so the idea of diaspora, the idea of stories, and the idea of peoplehood, and those are all really big topics. But I'd be interested to sort of hear how those relate for the Lenape. And I think that these are questions that we've been starting to think about a bit in my class as we think about Jewish community and what it means for what Jewish peoplehood means. And so it would be really interesting to hear from the Lenape perspective.
I thank you for that, because I really do think now I am always careful to point out that there are no two cultural stories that are the same. Um, we as Native Americans cannot identify with the African American experience in America, or the Jewish American experience, or the Jewish non-American experience. Um, so that's, as a disclaimer, it's important for me to get that out there, that we all have our particular and unique histories of persecution and of diasporic movements and of hiding in plain sight. But having that important thing said, I think there is, at some extent, at some general extent, something of a familiarity between groups that have faced serious persecution and particularly have been removed from their homelands through colonial ways or other ways of what's the word? Well, I'll just say forcibly through the people who have the power in the society. So I've had the privilege to speak at gatherings of other people, other peoples, other cultures who have had that same general familiarity. I've spoken at some of the African American history conventions and things like that. This is actually my first opportunity to speak to your group, and again, I'm really thankful for that. And it's such a difficult question, but an important question. You know, that diasporic movement, what I can say is specifically for us, for the Native Americans, and particularly for those of us on the East Coast, the Lenape, the Iroquois, those of us who were first encountered by the colonists, we are in kind of a particular circumstance in which we had this diasporic movement, and then we had these groups that stayed in our indigenous homeland. And if I can answer the first thing that comes to mind in response to your question of maybe specific ways this has affected us, is that unfortunately, one of the byproducts of this diaspora is that the federal recognition process, the federal guidelines for who the government will call Native American and not, has to some rather large extent driven a wedge between many of our Lenape nations and many other Native American nations as well. This process of recognition tends to make a division between federally recognized tribes and non-federally recognized tribes. And you can never make this as a blanket statement. I don't mean to say, you know, federal tribes don't like non-recognized tribes or anything like that. That's like saying Italians don't like Irish or something like that. You can never make blanket statements about a whole group. But one thing that I think is pretty particular to the Lenape, or at least to us first colonial contact groups, is that we do not have the best relationship with our diaspora, not nearly as much as we would like. And there are some groups and some loud voices of federally recognized tribes that don't recognize us out here in the homeland. And that's not just Lenape. Again, that's Lenape, Iroquois, a lot of the Eastern groups here. I like to try to think the best of all circumstances. I like to try to be an optimist without being naive. And I don't chalk this up to, stuffy nations who are elitist or anything like that. I see this as something that really the federal system demands, that the American government has put us in a position where all Native American communities who have recognition, they're really in a position where they're kind of scrambling at scraps for a table, right? They get federal funding, they have reservations, and they need that to support their people. And the government offers so much, and the more people who get recognized, the more people who are, reaching into that pie. So, although it's very unfortunate, I see this dissonance as a product of the federal recognition system, of the government system, that in some ways has turned relations into capitalistic competitors to secure what they need to further their people. Thank you so much for that. Really good question. I'm seeing questions come in from the chat here too. Yes. What is the role of Storykeeper? Oh, I think I started on that, and then I diverged a little bit. I had mentioned that the role of Storykeeper can be somewhat fluid. So, but when someone is a Storykeeper, it's a very literal title. I keep the stories for the nations. I have the knowledge of the stories. I have the history of our stories. A Storykeeper is not necessarily a storyteller. Most often the people you will hear telling our stories are ceremonial leaders who conduct our ceremonies and will come out and give those presentations. Now, I do tend to tell a lot of stories as well because I do have a history of an educator. I've got that teacher's voice, and I like to talk to people. So I do that, but that's not necessary. The Storykeeper is usually someone who just you go to learn about the stories, and the ceremonial leaders will often come to the Storykeeper to talk about, okay, maple ceremony is coming up. We're obviously going to tell our maple ceremony story. What else should we tell? And we'll talk about what other stories are good for the occasion. Now, again, because I'm lucky enough to have blended my academic life into my cultural life, I also bring kind of an academic historical role to the role of Storykeeper, because my dissertation research is on traditional Lenape stories. So in addition to what our elders tell, the stories I learned from my chief, I also have been able to include historical stories, traditional stories that are kind of hard to find into my role as Storykeeper. But yes, the long and short of it is that I know the stories, and that includes our legends, our mythology, but also our history and our current stories, important gatherings we have, important councils we have, events that we put on, in the history of initiatives we have right now. So that's the knowledge that is in my umbrella, and that's what I do. Thanks for that. Children's books on the Lenape. Any books specifically on the Lenape right now are really very difficult to find. That's something that hopefully, if I'm not being too ambitious, I hope to change. I'm working on an anthology of Lenape stories. The one thing that I will always recommend is the story of Rainbow Crow. Many of you may have heard of Rainbow Crow. This is a Lenape story, and it's probably the widest circulated. You can get a number of wonderful children's books that have great illustrations and language that's good for children. And if you're familiar with Greek history, it's a Promethean story that we would say in myth studies. It's a story of how fire came to earth, and we have our culture hero Rainbow Crow who flies to the sun and brings back fire. The kids love that book, and again, you can find great versions with wonderful pictures. Other than that, unfortunately, I cannot recommend to you any factual book specifically on the history of the Lenape that's good for children. History books, they are few and far between. There are great people. C.S. Westlogger does a great history. That's the one I usually recommend to people, but not like if you were going to present that information to kids, you'd have to read it and decide what you want to tell them. It's a very academic book. But the other thing I can recommend is any book by John Beerhorst on our legends and mythology, and I would particularly recommend The White Deer. Beerhorst is one of the few people who has focused on Lenape mythology specifically. There are some of our stories out there, but often we're lumped into books on Algonquin Indians, or just Native American literature, and you really have to know your stuff to be able to go there and figure out what's Lenape and what isn't. Beerhorst, we have an immense respect for him. He is not native, but he did wonderful ethnographic work with our people. He recorded our elders, so his stories are very true to our culture. The White Deer has some stories that I think translate very well to children. There's a culture hero we have called Wehi Khmukes, also called Crazy Jack, which is easier to pronounce, especially for the kids. And there are a couple adult elements in there that you would want to filter out, but as long as you do that cautiously for the kids, he's a wonderfully funny character. He's kind of a trickster hero who's always getting himself in ridiculous situations. I used to tell my niece stories of Wehi Khmukes all the time. And then another fun section for kids, also in this White Deer collection of stories, there's a whole section at the end just of dogs. The Lenape were very fond of dogs. There's a funny story about why dogs sniff each other's tails that you may have heard. If you've heard a culture story like that, that's gotten some circulation. So that's what I'd recommend for kids. Again, unfortunately, it's not history as far as straight history, but my opinion is that one of the best ways to get at a culture, especially indigenous cultures, historically, anthropologically, even linguistically, to get at the real essence of a culture is through their cultural stories and their cultural literature. So I think those are wonderful places to go. Great. How did my family pass their culture and history to me? Word of mouth. Really, it was all stories. Again, we had nothing written down. I grew up going to ceremony. I grew up, I was actually on our drum circle. But other than a couple activities like that, it wasn't a huge part of my life. I didn't grow up young with a strong identity of this is my Lenape culture, or these are parts of my Lenape heritage. It was really just kind of stuff I did as a kid and a young teen. And as a kid and a young teen, I had other stuff doing, and I didn't want to go to every family culture thing that mom was going to and wanted me to be involved in. It was kind of just part of life, and an interesting part of life that, in addition to Thanksgiving-ish holidays and Halloween, we would also have maple ceremony and corn planting. It was really when my mother started engaging the language. Our language is incredibly endangered. About 10 years ago, when we did an exhibit with the University of Pennsylvania, UPenn credited 4 people in the world with being able to speak the Lenape language conversationally, and that's all. I am fortunate enough that my mother is one of those 4 people. And when I was mid or maybe older teens, my mother took this on as her project, and it's been her life work ever since to work on revitalizing the language. And I was always kind of a language dork. Both my parents were English teachers. I loved language, and when I saw that, I really kind of engaged with that, and that was kind of my doorway into getting involved with the nation, was through that language. But yeah, that's how my culture was passed down. It was just through, going to maple ceremony, like people go to other holidays, and just kind of really organic and not a thing I thought specifically about, again, until that linguistic academic aspect came in. Um, how can we become allies to help Native Americans and our nation in particular? Thank you so much for that question. And there are so many ways. It really completely depends on you, and on how you would like to become involved. There's one of our biggest events, and you can find this on our website, is the Rising Nation River Journey. This is an event we do every 4 years, and this is coupled with the signing of the Treaty of Renewed Friendship. And you can read about the history. I don't want to spend too much time on the history right now, but every 4 years, we take a river journey. We paddle the length of Delaware. We start up in Hancock, New York, just under the mouth of the Delaware, and we take 3 or 4 weeks to paddle down to Cape May, New Jersey. And we stop along the way to sign what's become called the Treaty of Renewed Friendship. And this is not a legally binding treaty, it's just a symbolic agreement. And it really says 2 main things. The people who sign it with us are interested in acknowledging the Lenape as the indigenous people of this land and helping spread that knowledge however they can, whether it's hosting classes if they're a school, or just, telling friends about it if they're individuals. And also people agree to somehow act as good stewards of our environment. We're very environmentally conscious. The Delaware has always been an incredibly important river for us, culturally, spiritually, practically. So if this is something you're interested in, you can certainly email me, or you can keep an eye on the website. I am also the coordinator of the journey. I took over in 2018. I'll be doing it again. The next journey is coming up in 2022. And we have community partners, and we love all along the journey. We'll stop to give presentations or to attend presentations. For instance, one of our oldest partners are the Friends of the Wissahickon, a group that does a lot of trail work in the Wissahickon area. And we'll stop and we might do a treaty signing at one of their locations, and then they can take some time to talk about all the wonderful work they're doing, and they might ask us to do a cultural presentation. So the partnerships we've formed throughout the years, this started in 2002, have just been amazing. So if that's something you're interested in, whether it's just one event along the way, or you want to paddle with us for a day or two, or if you're masochistic enough for the whole thing, you're welcome to do that. It's a great time to connect not only with us, but also with other community partners that we have. That it's a great networking opportunity to get people together as well. Other things, we offer classes in the Lenape language. Again, I'm hesitant about using the term silver lining, but in this terrible pandemic that we're experiencing, one thing that has grown out of this is competence in Zoom, and a lot of people moving to Zoom. And our language classes, which we used to hold at the little community center up here in the Poconos, are now online. So like I said, our language is incredibly endangered. We do everything we can to try to revitalize that. If you're interested in learning or anything about the language, you can get in contact with us. And when I say get in contact, you can go to the website. By some incredibly ridiculous chain of events, I ended up being the webmaster, at least until I can find someone else who can do it better than I can. So there's a message function on the website, and when you send a message, it actually goes right to my personal email. And then I divvy it up where it goes. So you can contact me that way, and you can just say, hey, I was at the presentation the other day. Lenape-nation.org is our organization email. Same thing right now, that goes right to my email, so that comes to me, but also you're more than welcome to email me personally as well. I'm sorry, that should be an @ adam.depaul@temple.edu. Let me scroll up a little here because there were some other great questions, and 11:20, so we still have a little time. Please tell us some stories about your people. Oh, wow. How do I do this without taking up more time than we have? I can tell stories forever. What's a good... well, here's one of my favorites, and it's one of our most circulated, but within our community, most circulated still means incredibly obscure. In October, we'll get together and we'll tell the story of Meesing. You'll see many spellings for Meesing. If you look it up, try to do research. This is the spelling that we use in our spelling conventions. And I'll cut this down to make it not too terribly long. But in broad strokes, Meesing is a culture hero of ours. He watches over the animals. He's the protector of the animals, and specifically of the deer. And a long time ago, before humans were created, before two-leggeds walked the earth, Creator, Kishalamukong, is our name for creator, and he was thinking about creating two-leggeds. He was forming the thoughts. And at this time, the animals had a very strong connection with Kishalamukong, and they heard him, and they knew he was forming the thoughts of making the two-leggeds. And the animals were scared. They didn't like this idea. They thought about it, and they thought on it, and they decided that the two-leggeds were going to be harmful, that they were going to hurt them, that they were going to kill them in large numbers, that they were going to ruin their homes. So they called their protector Meesing, and they voiced their concerns to Meesing. And Meesing said, I'll go talk to Kishalamukong. I'll talk to Creator. So he did. Meesing went to talk to Creator, and he said, these are the concerns of the animals, and I share them. I don't think the two-leggeds are a good idea. I don't see why you would want to make them. Everything's wonderful now. So we really don't want you to make them. And Kishalamukong says, okay, I hear you, Meesing, and I'll tell you what, we'll have a competition. You see that mountain over there in the distance? Whoever can move that mountain will get their way. If I move it, I'll make the two-leggeds, and if you move it, I won't make the two-leggeds. So they have the competition, and Meesing uses all his might, all his physical might, all his mental energy, concentrates on the mountain, and can't budge it an inch, just can't. It's too big for him. And he finally stops, and he pants, and he's trying to catch his breath, and he hears a huge tumultuous roar coming from behind him, and he looks over his shoulder to see what this sound is, and he gets slammed in the face with, of course, the mountain that Creator has effortlessly hurled at him. And our images of Meesing depict this event. One half of his face is always deformed and a bit miscolored. And Meesing gets up. He's a Manipal, a very strong spirit, so of course he's okay. But it was enough to give him a little reality check. And he gets up and he says, okay, Creator. And Kishalamukong says, Meesing, thank you for coming to me. This is your job, and I'm glad you came to me on behalf of the animals. You did what you're supposed to do, but you also have to remember I have a plan, and I'm doing this for a reason. The two-leggeds are going to be made. I'm going to make them, and they will come here. But I'll tell you what, since you are so good on acting on behalf of your brethren, I'm going to give them rituals. I'm going to give them ceremonies to act on your behalf. And if they do not act these ceremonies, if they do not perform these rituals in a good way, you will take the animals away from them. You will take the deer away from them, and they will starve. And that's the story of our today, of our ideas of conserving and using only what we need when we hunt and gather food. That if we don't do things in a respectful and responsible way, and if we don't say our ceremonies to Kisha Lamukong before that happens, that they'll take the food away from us. Just one of many stories, but one of the ones you may hear here and there. Children's books, stories. Oh, great. People are saying they're going to email me. That's wonderful. Unless I'm missing it, that's all I see here. Is there anything else anyone wanted to ask? I can certainly talk a little bit more, but, or did I miss anything in the chat?
I have a question for you. I'm
Sure.
Maria Goldwyn, and actually we're in New York. We're part of a satellite school. And I have in the past worked with various, I'm an art teacher, and in the past I've worked with various nations. I've been to New Mexico on teaching grants. And just this fall, I had an artist, Hayden Hayes, who is from the Seneca Nation and the Deer Clan. He's one of the last bone carvers. And so he was in my classroom virtually. We got a chance to see his studio and see some of his work. And then my students did some soap sculptures afterwards. So this is kind of, my son and I have both been listening, but this is more of an interest for my students as a teacher role rather than a parent role. If I reached out to you via email, could we talk a little more about seeing if we could make some kind of connection educationally for some of my students?
Absolutely, I would love that. I'm a lifelong educator. My master's degree is actually in education. I've made tons of unit plans and curriculum, and I've designed my own Native Studies course at the college level. So I love to be involved in that. Please do reach out to me.
And when I taught elementary, I did Rainbow Crow every year. And it was
That's wonderful.
something that the kids absolutely adored. It's one of my favorite Native American tales as well. But yeah, I just think it's so important for students to hear this and learn more. So yeah, I'll email you then and see what we can do connection wise. Thank you.
Thank you for that. I look forward to it. Yeah.
I have a question. Oh, so go ahead, Rabbi Jonah. Rabbi Jonah had one in the.
Hi, and Adam, I'm so sorry I didn't get to actually say hello before. I had a little conflict during the beginning, but I'm back. And this has been a wonderful presentation. I'll ask my question. I'm just wondering if there are stories that are kept. I guess these would be stories that are not quite as old, perhaps, but stories about alliances that have been formed between the Lenape Nation and I guess foreigners, people of European or African or Asian or any other continental descent, and the ways that these alliances have helped the Lenape Nation in any way.
Yes, and I'm going to type two things in here. One is another book by John Bierhorst, just simply called The Mythology of the Lenape. And another thing I'm going to type here is William Penn's own account of the Lenni, Lenape, or Delaware Indians. And I'm typing fast, and I don't want that to take up too much time, so excuse the lack of capitalization. These are two books that have stories in one way or another directly related to that. And it's very interesting, and it can be difficult for some people to wrestle with. This book from Beerhorst, the last book I gave you, The White Deer, is actually a collection of stories. This has a couple of stories, but it's much more academic. It has fragments and themes and some ethnography work. But there are two stories specifically about the Lenape's first contact with colonists, with white people. And the stories cause some dissonance. They're very interesting to analyze, because both of the stories definitely have elements that you would expect. They tell ways that the Lenape were worse off in some ways, some unfortunate things that happened. But that's not the point of these stories. The stories overall are very positive. And there's an element, especially one, and if I remember correctly, it's just called The History of the Lenape and White People, or The First Meeting of Lenape and White People, that relates the very historical truth that many Lenape did see the colonists as not, I don't want to say saviors or superior, but as a race of people who were very advanced and who came here bestowing gifts and knowledge that we didn't have. And you know, it's something to grapple with, because we know how colonialism turned out, and we know unfortunate things happened, but that's, well, a horribly dismissive way to put it, but for lack of better language. But yeah, as far as the optimism and the respect and excitement with which many of us greeted the colonists and some of those first interactions, there are two wonderful stories in the Beerhorst book, Mythology of the Lenape. Now, those are cultural stories that have developed around those events. The second book, William Penn's Own Account of the Lenni Lenape, these are not native stories. These are actually facsimiles of William Penn's letters to back home to England, to his settlers, and to the Lenape, all regarding the Lenape Native Americans. However, they give a wonderful sense of the respect with which William Penn held the Lenape. Of course, much of our history is romanticized in one way or another, but if you heard that William Penn had a good relationship with us, that's one thing that's very accurate. We still respect William Penn in our treaties today. The Treaty of Renewed Friendship starts out in the spirit of Chief Tammany and of William Penn. And as a story keeper, I tell stories that I've gotten from William Penn's letters about how he revered our language, about how he insisted on having Lenape translators at any kind of land dealing or trade, so the Lenape knew exactly what was happening. And there's even a section in there where he turns to his people and says, you know, you all might do a little better to adopt some of the Lenape ways.
Wow.
So I love both of those books for some positive stories about that interaction. Thank you for that. I see the chat moving, but I also know it's 11:33, so you let me know.
I think we have time for about 10 or 15 more minutes or so.
I only gave that
great.
time frame because I wasn't sure when Rabbi Jonah wanted to wrap this.
Yeah, sure. I think we'll go till about 11:45, if that's okay, Adam.
We try to be as
Absolutely.
flexible as possible, so it's.
By the way,
Yeah,
if you're
great.
a student, you can put on your video so that we know you're still there. But I know you're there, but just love to see your faces too. But Adam, I see a few different questions. Rabbi Diana, and then we'll get to Amy's question, but Rabbi Diana asked, with the history of hiddenness, are there people coming to realize they've got Lenape background now? And if so, how? Are there people who don't come out and they continue to have some Lenape identity hidden?
Absolutely, there are. And this is a real struggle for us today, is how can our people who have gone through this history of intentionally hiding every aspect of their culture, how can they regain it now? How can they reclaim and revitalize it now? We have a genealogical committee who works specifically on helping people who know they have a connection through family stories or things like that, to help them find a solid genealogical connection. Because our nation and all nations of which I'm familiar do require a proven bloodline back to the Lenape. And that can be incredibly difficult because, as I said, for us East Coast Lenape who remained here, we identified as white on the census data to fit in and to not be identified. We were very often not accorded birth certificates, and very often not permitted to be buried in Christian cemeteries. And we had our different cemeteries, and there weren't very good records. So establishing these connections is very often a method of having someone tell us their stories, tell us their situations. A lot of information actually comes from old newspaper clippings, county records. There might be a property, a deed of sale, where we see, James Borger bought property from Anne Sexton, and then that's something for some reason someone has a clipping of. And then in our genealogy, we've already established that the Borgers were a colonial family. Borger was a colonial man with a Lenape wife, and we can say, there's your connection. Here it is in paper. It's not a legal birth record or something, but here's proof of your marriage, and through our other chief who's related to the Borgers, we know. So it's a lot of detective work, very often. And as far as are there people who do not come out as Lenape? Absolutely. And there are several reasons that happens. One way is that they might have those stories, they might know through their family, through spoken word, like I said, that they are Lenape, but we can't find that connection. Unfortunately, we can't find the supporting documents. And we continue to work with those people to try to find those documents so they can become official members of the nation. But again, because of our history of hiding, it can be very difficult sometimes. But another reason, the history of persecution of Native Americans in America, this is not ancient history, right? This isn't even revolutionary history. We still have elders today who were put in Native American boarding schools. And if this is something with which you're not familiar, in very, very broad strokes summary, these were schools designed to corral Native Americans in. And the tagline of the schools, and this is not like hearsay, this is what was written, this was the going motto of these schools, was kill the Indian, save the man. And the purpose of these schools was to make Native Americans white people, to get their language out of them, to get their culture out of them, to teach them white ways and to make them good Americans. And we still have elders who went to these schools. And this is just a way of emphasizing that there are still members, and very often the majority of them are elders, who are not comfortable identifying as Lenape. To themselves, they know their culture and they're proud of that. But even something like this, even when we go out and give presentations to colleges or anyone, no matter how reputable the organization, there are still elders who get uneasy about that because they are so ingrained and have been so closely and personally affected by this history of having to hide everything and keep it to yourself, that it makes them uneasy to identify, to say, celebrate, especially publicly, their culture. So yes, there are reasons definitely for folks out there who are Lenape and either don't publicly proclaim it or do, but don't actually join a nation and take part in a community.
Thank you, Adam.
Oh, sure.
I see Amy actually shared before you entered, I believe, that she actually works in museums and has a history of working on different projects of different indigenous populations. And she asks, do you work with museums? How do you see the role of cultural institutions to share your culture and stories in a respectful way?
I absolutely do, and I adore them. I currently actually curate 4 exhibits, one at our cultural center, one at the Chat Center for Humanities at Temple, another one at the Slate Belt Heritage Center, and another one at a little place called the One Room Public Schoolhouse by us. I love exhibits. I think they're really important as long as they're done well. Because I do a lot of work with museums and exhibits, something else I do is consulting work on exhibits and things that I don't necessarily curate or help build. But there are, especially because of our history of that diaspora that developed and got a lot of public attention, exhibits about us, about the indigenous Lenape, can often be inaccurate. They can often incorporate elements of Western or Central customs that really weren't developed until that forced relocation. 2 of the largest examples, you'll see, everybody has probably seen pictures of the fabulous, beautiful, big headdresses with all the feathers and things like that. Those are incredibly Native American, very beautiful, but we out here, the Lenape, did not originally have those. You couldn't run, 100 feet through the Pennsylvania woods in a headdress like that and not have it torn to shreds. That was something developed, that was a custom of the Eastern, the Central, the Plains Native Americans. And the Lenape who were pushed out there adopted those through amalgamations and syncretization with other cultures out there. The same thing goes for turquoise. You'll see all the beautiful ornate turquoise jewelry that Native Americans have. Turquoise doesn't exist out here on the East Coast, right? We didn't have turquoise. That's a stone that's mined out, again, in Central Western. The Lenape, our relations out there, absolutely make that beautiful turquoise jewelry. But for exhibits talking about the indigenous Lenape of this area, we never had turquoise. So little things like that. And this is just a long way of saying absolutely. I work with exhibits, I curate them myself, and I also kind of fact check or consult on them. So please reach out to me for opportunities to do stuff like that. I'd love to hear from you.
Thank you so much, Adam. I think we have time for just the 2 last questions that are in this chat. So Jason asked, actually, what's the, is there any use in Ancestry.com or 23andMe to trace the histories of people of indigenous descent?
It's okay. I don't like to say no. I don't like to shut that down entirely. But what I will say is that those sites don't do what most people think they do. There is really a very general and generic amount of information that can be offered by DNA. We're still really, anthropologists are still practically going off the model they've been going off forever, which is, and these are scholastic terms, these are academic terms, that your DNA tells you that you are either Caucasoid, Negroid, or Mongoloid. Native Americans fall into that anthropological category of Mongoloid. Much of what's done on this site, believe it or not, is actually guesswork. That's why they have you put a lot of information in about your family name. When were you born? They take your DNA, but they also combine it with, where does this family name pop up? What's the etymology of this name? And it's kind of a computer generated best guess. So they can be fascinating. I don't discourage people from using them. But if you're going to use one of those kind of mail-in DNA sites, or even just history sites, I say don't let it be your conclusion either way. Don't let it be the final word on whether you are or are not anything. I find still family stories and doing research and listening to your elders in your family are more reliable of your history than the internet sites, although they can be fascinating and important.
Thank you, Adam. It looks like our last question might be from Mike Meixler. Mike asked, what is the relationship today between the Lenape Nation and the Amish?
You know, that is a wonderful question. And unfortunately, to the best of my knowledge, I don't know of any working relationship with the Amish. You know, we have a wonderful relationship with the Quakers, with many Quaker organizations. We have churches in our community. I'm so happy, again, to establish this relationship with you folks. I'm actually speaking at another Jewish community center very soon. But in particular, the Amish, I can't say I remember working with them. That may have something to do with, we don't have a lot of people in kind of the Lancaster area where they have a very strong concentration. So it might be a matter of just geography. But yeah, I'm sorry, for whatever reason, I don't have any knowledge of us working with the Amish.
Thank you, Adam. I realized there was one question we overlooked from the Lermans, which was, this might be a long question, but if you can give a short answer, that would be great. And then I'll just have one final thing for you, Adam, which is, Adam, would you be able to speak a little bit about cultural appropriation versus using Native themes because somebody loves Native themes, whether it's the way they dress or they love to tell stories or draw these stories, whatever it is. Could you talk to us a little bit about that?
You're right. It's a huge question, but I can give you a short answer because we've talked about this very often, particularly recently in council. Many people are emailing us about school mascots and representation and things like that. So here it is. Now remember, I'm from the Lenape Nation of Pennsylvania. I can speak for myself. I can speak for council. I cannot speak for any other Lenape people or Native American people. But our council sentiment is, we love it when people engage our culture. We love it to hear our stories told, to see our traditions passed on. And we do not think you have to have a bloodline to the Lenape to appreciate and respect our culture and even to partake in it. Obviously, the caveat is that you have to do so respectfully. The absolute best answer is talk to us, get in touch with us. You know, you might be wearing turquoise earrings because you think it honors the indigenous Lenape here and not be aware that the history is wrong. Reach out to us. We're always happy to field questions of this is accurate, this is fine. If you want to tell our stories in a classroom, that's wonderful. Just be careful what unit you put them in. Please don't put our creation story in a fiction unit. You know, and please attribute us to these things. And if you're going to go put on a dance, you know, attribute us and let us help counsel you in that. The last part of that, as far as mascots and representation and things like that, we have decided that we prefer not to be represented in mascots, you know, pictures, things like that. And the reason is that even people who do it sensitively, even people who don't have obvious stereotypical or racial things like red skins or pictures, what these tend to do is root us in the past. They tend to reinforce the idea to the world that we're an artifact from history to be studied and remembered as a people that once were. And we want people also to remember that we're still here, and we use computers and iPhones and we drive cars. So we don't want to have that freeze frame where people just remember that we something about a French war, in colonial times.
Thank you, Adam. I just want to say for you, first off, we're very grateful for the opportunity to learn from you. It is said that Jewish people, it's sort of unclear what we always believe, but we're sort of a people of action in many ways, more than we're a people of faith. And I'm wondering if there's any charge that you have for us of things that we should do, one or two things that we can do for actions to be good neighbors that you'd like to offer us. And we'll also, I also recognize the time is short, but however we can be of help, please let us know one or two actions we can do for the Lenape Nation.
That's wonderful. The first, thank you so much for offering that. And the first thing, everything we do, we have a kind of a mantra, you could say, that we think of the next 7 generations. We think of anything that we do and how it's going to affect the next 7 generations. And that leads us to what we say, always move things forward in a good way. And the best thing anyone here can do is just take this knowledge that you learned here today, this information about us, and just bring it forward in a good way, whether it's into your classrooms, into your social circles. Just don't forget me. Don't forget us, and help people correct this misinformed history that we're not here anymore. The second thing I would say, going back to, I talked about this a little bit before, things like getting involved with the river journey, the treaty signing, language classes. There are many other opportunities. We have great opportunities for students that might be academically viable. So get in touch. Really, we love to engage with people. We love to have those community partners. And whether it's the river journey or a school project, I'll talk to you. We'll talk to you about how we can help each other, and hopefully we can benefit your community as well.
Thank you so much, Adam. And thank you for sharing with us so much of your history, and thank you for keeping these stories, and thank you for keeping what you keep. And we hope to hold on to everything you've given us today and to be good neighbors as much as we can. I do have to end this because students have to be somewhere in 3 minutes. But I want to thank you, Adam. Adam gave his contact information before. He's adam.depaul@temple.edu, correct? So do email him some follow-ups, because I know there are more questions that are coming. And Amy, I saw you had a question we didn't get to. But thank you, everybody. And Chet Tet and Vav Zayin students, I'll see you in 2 minutes in our e-assembly room. Thank you so much, Adam, and have a great day,
Thanks, everybody. You too. Thank you.
Thank you.